Story 1. 18 years old, sitting on a mattress on the floor in my first apartment. I was so happy. You have no idea. Story 2. Looking at my grandfather lying dead in his bed, with a smile on his face. My grandmother had died 10 years earlier, and I realized that the two people who loved me most in this world were gone. Story 3. I remember being around 10 or 11 years old and thinking I hadn't played with my action figures in a while. I pulled out my G.I. Joe and spread them all out, just looking at them. I tried to play with them, but felt like I couldn't find the joy or childlike imagination to make it work. I began putting them away, crying as I realized I wasn't a child anymore and reflecting on how much they once meant to me. But now they were just pieces of plastic in a box. Story 4. When I was walking into college at age 17 and it started snowing, my first thought was, it's going to be difficult to get home this evening rather than snow. Story 5. When I came home after joining the army, my room was no longer my room. It felt like this isn't my home anymore. It's my parents' home. While I am always welcome, this place has now become a transient stop for me in life. Story 6. A week ago, I would have said 9/11 when I was stationed in Washington, D.C., and my parents were 500 miles away. But right now, I'm thinking about 2 days ago when my dad passed. I'm 42. Story 7. My mom picked me up at school in a taxi and took me across the country to see relatives I didn't know I had. After 6 weeks of sleeping on couches, she told me she was getting a divorce from my father. I was 7, and that's when I started to deal with adult issues. Story 8. When I was 7 years old, I almost died. My parents were ignoring a severe asthma attack I was experiencing. I woke up struggling to breathe, and I thought, wow, I am going to die. And this hurts so much that being dead would be better. They rushed me to the hospital, and fortunately, I survived, but it was touch and go for a couple of days. After that point, I realized I had to look out for myself because my parents sure weren't going to do it. Both of my parents would share their relationship problems with each other, so I never really had a boundary between adult life and childhood in terms of what I knew. From then on, I acted like a small adult in my own home. I made my own food, did my own laundry, and if I could have had a job, I would have. I often had to demand that my parents take me to the doctor. I had no faith in their ability to care for me, and that feeling never left. This was especially true after the divorce, when both of them were so poor and depressed that we often had temporary living situations and sometimes not enough food. Yes, I have complex post-traumatic stress disorder from my childhood neglect. So what? Story 9. I never felt free to be a kid and never really started feeling like an adult. I'm not sure I ever will. When I finally learned to drive, bought a car, and was driving around in my own vehicle, I felt somewhat like an adult. Story 10. When I took care of my siblings and handled house chores because my parents separated when I was 13, I assumed their responsibilities at a young age. Story 11. I had a dream where I was walking in the snowy woods, and in the distance, I saw a reindeer engulfed in a peaceful blue flame. I was about 19 at the time. I woke up and cried. Story 12. As insane as it sounds, I'm in my mid-40s. And it wasn't until my dad died a year and a half ago that I realized I was the more responsible adult. I know how it sounds, but I really didn't see it coming. I always had a more mature person to turn to. Now my children, who are in their mid-20s, are looking to me for guidance. I can provide answers, but sometimes it feels like they just want to bounce something off me. He would go to the emergency room with me every time to ensure he could talk to the doctors. He attended every appointment and would ask them directly about their actions. He often questioned why they couldn't figure out why I was so sick. He was there to answer questions because he knew everything that was happening, and he challenged them because he was a wealthy, older man. They listened to him more than they listened to me. He gave me the strength to fight back. That was another realization that I was the adult. It's funny to me that I never imagined a life without my parents. I had my first child at 19, and that did not make me feel like an adult, even though I fully embraced my role. I had 2 children by the time I was 24 and got married. I still didn't feel like an adult. It's only now that this realization is truly hitting me, and it has been a struggle. But the trade-off was that I had the most fantastic dad in my life. I had the gift of 44 years with him, and my children also got to spend so much time with him. I miss him deeply, but I am honored to have been a part of his life. I'm still heavily grieving. Sometimes, it feels like I can't breathe. Story 13. 18 years old and still have 5 months of high school left. I am in an apartment on my own, hoping I will make it. Story 14. I moved away and then returned to visit my high school friends about a year later. They all seemed immature and focused on unimportant things and making poor decisions. However, I realized they hadn't changed. I had. I still love them, but we have grown very distant. Story 15. I wasn't even in first grade yet. My dad came marching down the stairs, looked at me and yelled, "There's no such thing as Santa Claus. You're never getting anything in your stocking again." Then he marched back up the stairs and left me crying while I sat next to the stockings hanging over the fireplace. I had been talking to him about how I couldn't wait to see what Santa was bringing me that day or the days before. My friend, who attended a religious school, had been talking about Santa, and so naturally I started discussing it at home too. I can't remember if this was before or after my mom died. She passed a couple of months after I turned 7. Come to think of it, she passed 41 years ago today. Happy anniversary. Boy, do I miss you, Mom. Story 16. When I had to worry about the police being at our house every day after coming home on the school bus. I think I was 8 or 9. Story 17. I got my driver's license at 16 and my first job. Christmas became about socks and maybe a gift card. That felt transformative, but not in an alarming way. Felt like natural progression and development. Story 18. I was 18 years old and the first child in my family. When I was 15 or 16, I got drunk for the first time at a house party. My parents were on vacation, and I didn't go with them. That party became legendary among the other kids at school. Story 19. When I got my first proper job, I walked into the office and realized everyone was much older than I was. Story 20. When I began to figure out what to prepare for dinner each day and also pay for it. Story 21. When my childhood best friend, high on meth, wielded knives at a neighbor and then got into a fistfight with me when I tried to stop her. Story 22. When I realized I was working for a problematic company and I was the only one who could do anything about it. No one was going to help me or stand up for me. Story 23. When I started making doctor's appointments by myself, I realized that no one was going to do it for me anymore. Story 24. When I shifted my focus from video games and sports to thinking about when I could afford my own car and how to navigate relationships, I was 15. Story 25. When my younger brother moved out and had his first baby, we no longer lived at my mom's house. He now has 2 children, and we rarely spend time together. I have no children and live alone. It's depressing, but that's when I realized it would never be like it was when we were growing up and could just hang out whenever we wanted to. Story 26. 18 years old in a college dorm. I became so sick I thought I might die, and there was no one to take care of me, like my parents used to when I lived with them. It dawned on me that from now on, I am the one responsible for taking care of myself. Story 27. 1 year in my early teens, I had a great Christmas. There was nothing to complain about, but the magic and excitement of it all were just gone. Story 28. When I moved out of my parents' place, I dreaded it for so long. However, when the time actually came, it was liberating. Story 29. I am 30 years old and often feel like a child dealing with bills and responsibilities. Story 30. I bought my first car. Driving away from the dealership, I realized what a significant purchase I had just made at the age of 16. It was an old Kia, but it allowed me to get to work and spend time with friends without relying on my parents. It felt like gaining a set of wings. Story 31. Getting off the cattle car in basic training at Fort Benning and running the gauntlet of screaming drill sergeants. Story 32. Shortly after turning 18, my dad told me, "Well, you're technically a man now, but as long as you live under this roof, you'll abide by my rules." I left and never looked back. Story 33. My mother started leaving me home alone when I was around 13 for weeks at a time. She would come home, stock the fridge, and tell me she had been working the third shift at General Motors and was home while I was at school, only gone on the weekends. I would do things like prop the broom against the front door, and it would stay in place without being moved. I thought it was okay at that age, but now I realize how much trauma it left behind. Story 34. My first job was lifeguarding at a small private beach when I was 15. The training for my lifeguard certification felt like any other after-school activity. It was fun and kind of exciting. I was going to sit in a chair in the sun, make a significant amount of money. Minimum wage was much higher than what I earned mowing lawns and doing odd jobs. Maybe get to do some dramatic rescues and possibly meet Pamela Anderson. It would be great. Instead, I ended up working for the most difficult boss I have ever encountered. He broke every water safety law. I was always lifeguarding alone, watching 30 to 50 swimmers by myself, all while working concessions at the same time. It was wildly unsafe and illegal. He would find reasons to publicly yell at me every shift in front of the entire beach. His wife was often intoxicated and constantly hit on me, even though I was just 15. He made me handle parking on busy weekends while I was also supposed to be watching the water, which I couldn't even see from the parking lot. At least once a week, he would get so drunk that he and his friends would pressure me to drink with them, which I did not want to do. They frightened me. I did not tell my parents any of this because I was proud to have a job and did not want to seem unprepared. I thought this was what being an adult would always be like. Story 35. I cannot pinpoint a moment, but at the age of 23, I no longer felt like a child or youthful. Something about that age seemed like a siren of responsibility. It would no longer be acceptable to be aimlessly wandering around the city without any direction in my life. It was around this time that I returned to school and started working full-time. Story 36. High school graduations. Although my childhood may have ended a long time ago, I still feel like that same child often. Story 37. In high school, I got my first part-time job. With my first paycheck, my mother informed me that I would have to buy my own bus passes to get to school, my own shampoo and conditioner and clothes. This was the early 1980s and clothing styles were exciting. She disliked everything I chose, but I didn't care. Story 38. I experienced severe abuse as a child. My childhood began when I started working with children while also working in mental health. As I prepare to become a first-time mom, my own childhood is poised for a significant transformation. I am excited to apply the valuable lessons I have learned and to recreate my favorite memories from working with different families. I anticipate that my focus on my childhood will shift when my children are grown, allowing me to concentrate solely on my mental health career. Story 39. When my mom lost her house, the one I mostly grew up in, it hurts knowing I don't have a home to go back to. I see many people take that for granted now. Story 40. I left my father's house after selling items I didn't use, such as a Game Boy Advance in games, for groceries because we were struggling financially. I found his stash of empty cocaine baggies, and there had to be at least 50. I moved out that night and have been on my own since then. Story 41. I tend to think of childhood as before school began, but I understand we are talking about when we realized we were adults. It was when my future wife and I were 23 and got our first apartment. I remember lying in bed talking in the dark, and I said, I don't know. It still feels like we're camping. It was around that time that I realized how the tether was cut. Story 42. At 14 years old, I had to get a work permit. My first paycheck went towards paying the electric bill. I wasn't upset, we were poor. After that, I never felt like a kid again. Story 43. Maybe not childhood, but when my husband and I were 27 or 28, we moved from New York City, where we mainly hung out with college friends our age, whom we had known since we were 18, to San Francisco so he could attend graduate school. During the first week of school, he made a friend and invited her and her husband over for dinner. She was our age, but we found out her husband was 35, and we could not handle it. It was unbelievable that we had a 35-year-old friend or peer. To make it even stranger, they got divorced about a year later, and then we really couldn't believe that we had a divorced friend. Adulthood was just slapping us in the face. Story 44. Turning 18. I remember speaking with my vice principal before the school day began in the hall. Story 45. When I got my period at 9 years old in 4th grade, I had no one my age to talk to about it since I was the first in my friend group to experience it. Story 46. I was watching The Muppets and the song Rainbow Connection played as the credits rolled. I cried. I just knew that my youth was over. Now, hearing that song makes me feel sad. Story 47. When my grandmother died, we had to stop my mom from crawling into the mausoleum with her. I spent the last year of middle school helping her through a nervous breakdown on my own, as she had burned some family bridges during her grieving process. Story 48. I was fired from my first professional job after college. During the year I worked there, I had a boss who was the most humorless and impatient person I had ever met. I was working 60 hours a week and basically had no social life because in my free time, I just wanted to drink or sleep. The day I got fired came about 3 days after I discovered that my ex was being unfaithful. So as you can imagine, my home life wasn't very supportive. As I left the office, I called my mom, sobbing. Probably the hardest I had ever cried as an adult. Story 49. Standing on the yellow footprints at Paris Island with 3 large, intimidating individuals shouting at me for no reason. Story 50. Watching my grandmother deteriorate into a fragile state as cancer affected her mind until she finally passed away was a deeply painful experience. I was 9 years old. Story 51. Whenever I looked around and realized I had no more family or friends and that I had finally escaped the abuse. Story 52. The first time I got fired from a job was significant. It was the first occasion when my actions had life-altering consequences. Luckily, I was still in high school, so I didn't depend on that job too much. Story 53. When I was 14, my mom told me I had to start helping with the bills. So, I got a job washing dishes at a restaurant that I could ride my bike to and started paying bills. By the time I was 15, she stopped treating me like a child and treated me more like an adult. Story 54. I was sexually assaulted when I was 12, and no one believed me. I knew I was the only adult who was going to take care of me. Story 55. When I left for college, my dad told me to give him my key to the house and to call before I came home. Story 56. Not really over, but at Christmas in 2009, I was 14 years old. Usually, on Christmas mornings, I would wake up early, super excited to see my presents. I often couldn't sleep all night from the excitement, but this Christmas, I woke up late. I even had presents left out from Santa that year. I remember my mom came and woke me up. It was around 10 in the morning. While I was lying in bed, I thought that I would never feel that excitement for Christmas again. Story 57. Childhood never ends as long as you are joyfully learning something new. As an older person, I can tell you that life becomes very dull very quickly when there is no sense of wonder. Story 58. My grandmother had just died on Christmas Eve, and I was crying. We were very close. My stepmother told me to stop crying and that I had nothing to cry about. I was 10 years old. Story 59. I had already been living on my own for years, but it was driving my mom to the hospital at 3 a.m. after she tripped and hit her head. It felt like the beginning of a shift from having someone who was completely responsible for taking care of you to, as time goes on, becoming responsible for taking care of them. Story 60. When I was 12, my father and brother left me with my alcoholic mother, and I began caring for her instead of her caring for me. Story 61. Starting my first full-time job after college. I was an adult by then, but the reality of this being my life for the next 50 years truly caused me some depression. Story 62. About a month after turning 13, I had just finished my 3rd round of chemotherapy for stage 4 lymphoma. The doctor was trying to determine the cause of my pain, asking if it was as bad as last time when I needed multiple abdominal drains, round-the-clock pain medication, and a week delay in treatment to address the issue. Story 63. Getting pregnant at 17 was the best thing to happen to me. However, I had to grow up quickly. Story 64. When my mom died, I was in my 20s, already living on my own with a full-time job. When she passed away, I finally realized that my family safety net would not be there for me forever. After that, my childhood bedroom was packed up, and everything was either moved into my current apartment, sold, tossed out, or put into storage. I no longer have any family in my hometown, and everything I didn't know I was clinging to is gone. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It just forced me to confront parts of my childhood that I didn't know I hadn't let go of yet. Story 65. The night before my senior prom 4 years ago, my mom was practicing doing my hair for the next day, and it all hit me at once. I started crying. She asked, "What's wrong?" I told her, "I can't believe I'm almost grown." Story 66. In my early teens, I realized that my parents did not actually love each other. It was a facade to maintain appearances. Story 67. Paying my own dental bill for the first time. Nothing signifies adulthood like realizing that dental care is a luxury. Story 68. At 10 years old, I was forced to eat beer pea soup to make a good impression on my father's mother-in-law for his second wife. I realized I had my first hangover after consuming 2 large bowls to show how much I appreciated her cooking. Afterwards, the wife told me that when he was not home, she never wanted to see me. When I told him, he took out his thick belt and beat me for questioning her. Story 69. When I visited my old playground, everything felt so small. I wondered if I was ever actually that tiny. Story 70. At age 6, I experienced abuse and felt I could never tell my mother because she would either blame me or not believe me. Story 71. When I saw a group of teenagers at the mall being loud and annoying, I felt like an old man shaking my fist at them. Story 72. That first winter after moving out, I realized nobody was reminding me to wear a coat. I was on my own now. Story 73. When Christmas morning no longer felt magical, and I was more excited about sleeping in than receiving presents. Story 74. In 2011, a tsunami occurred. My partner at the time went missing. They were okay in the end, but we both aged several years over the course of a few days. Story 75. When I had to sign my first lease, I suddenly understood why adults are always stressed about bills. Story 76. When my parents separated, things got serious and emotionally challenging. I was 19 at the time, and it felt like the small, happy part of myself that I had reclaimed after struggling with an eating disorder was officially gone. Story 77. When I asked for money for gas, I was told, "You think I'm going to just give you money for gas? Get a job." 16. Story 78. I brought my cat in to be euthanized and stayed with him until the end. My dad used to be the one to take the animals and stay with them. In that moment, I knew I was no longer a child. It felt like a full circle, as I had been there when my cat was born and then when he died. Story 79. It was sometime in the winter after I turned 16, meaning it was 1986 or maybe early 1987. A couple of my friends and I met up at my old elementary school on a snowy winter day and goofed around sledding, throwing snowballs, and doing kid stuff. I remember thinking, even as we were there, that this wasn't going to happen again because we were too old for it. And it didn't happen again. But for a couple of hours, we were like children having a blast. Story 80. I distinctly remember watching my parents argue with my younger sibling. I knew exactly why they were upset and also understood why my sibling had done what they did. It was a rare moment of understanding both perspectives, and that's when I realized I would gradually shift more to the adult side over time while losing the perspective of a child. Story 81. When my mom passed away when I was 15, I had to become the parent of my little sister. I lost a lot of my childhood, and the family disconnect after her passing made me more independent. Story 82. When I was 6, the moment my mom punched me so hard I ended up on the other side of the room was when I realized something was very wrong. Story 83. The night my cousin committed suicide, I was left alone on my other cousin's dining room floor to spend the night. I was 11. Story 84. After my first experience at 25 years old with a coworker, I have a feeling that was the reason she hired me, honestly. Story 85. I joined the Army Reserves in late 2000 for college money. I completed basic training between my junior and senior years and finished in August 2001, waiting for life to become easier. Story 86. When I was 9 years old, my mom, sister, and half-brother had just moved to New Jersey with my stepdad, who got a job there. We had been living in Missouri previously. I didn't really understand that I wouldn't get to see my dad or the rest of my family regularly anymore, and I was sad about it one day. As I came out of the bathroom, my mom saw me crying and hugged me, then asked why I was upset. I said, "Because I miss my dad," and she pushed me away and said, "I don't want to hear that." Story 87. Maybe not childhood, but adulthood hit hard when I got my first job out of college. I moved 10 hours away from any friends or family. It was a somber moment. I sat on my couch and shed a tear in silence from the anxious feeling of truly being on my own. That is a moment I think most people do not forget. Story 88. During my first semester at college, my dad called to catch up. One of his first questions was, "You're not moving back, are you?" I also switched my bedroom to my younger sister's room while I was still living with them before I went away for college. This made me realize I was no longer welcome and was expected to stay away. Story 89. Many of these experiences are serious yet relatable. Here's a light-hearted collection of thoughts. I feel genuinely excited about getting a rack to organize my things. I admire kitchens that look clean, and I appreciate all those fancy marble countertops. I become suspicious when I see groups of teenagers traveling together in a store. I've realized I'm out of touch with the slang that kids use nowadays. A teenager I worked with told me about her vaporizer pen and asked if I wanted to try it. She talked about how great it was, saying she would never use anything else. I eagerly responded, but it turned out it wasn't a pen for writing, which left me disappointed. Another teenager asked me about a popular social media platform, and I responded, "What's that? I'm 27, but it feels like they might be digging up my fossils before long." Story 90. I was raped at 15. Walking home, I felt my underwear soaked in blood and my innocence lost, which really affected me. When I got to my bedroom, I found out my older sisters in their 30s had been reading my diary and were upset that I was writing about them. I screamed at them to leave me alone and tore my diary to shreds. Then I texted my only friend to tell them I had been raped. Their response was, "What are you complaining about? At least you're getting some." I believe that's when my childhood ended. Story 91. When my mom started insulting me instead of comforting me when I was sad, it was difficult to bear. Here are some of the insults I've received over the years: loser, freak, weirdo, sociopath, boring, and lazy Canadian. Although we are from Germany, I am half Canadian and participating in an exchange program which has changed me a bit. There are many more insults as well. Story 92. At 12, when my mom tried to stab me with a pair of scissors, I was on my back while she was on top, attempting to push the scissors into my eye. I clearly felt the moment my brain shifted from fighting for my life to surrendering. I think she noticed I was ready to let her do it and got off just as I went slack. From that point on, I went through life barely existing instead of truly living. Story 93. I actually need this right now. I totally agree with this. It is really difficult to deal with toxic coworkers. Story 94. I was 19, smoking a cigarette during a break, sitting on the sidewalk outside my work. I had just been essentially forced into an assistant manager position, and the other assistant manager, a 20-year-old who was really cool, and I had been tasked with saving the store because the store manager was an alcoholic but couldn't be fired. I remember those few minutes so clearly, thinking, okay, how are we going to do this? We need to take shifts going through the applications and making phone calls. There was a moment of realization like, wait, am I a kid? Who is letting me run a store? Oh well, this is happening. We did end up saving that store. It ran for about 6 more years off the work we did in a few months in 2012 before the entire company folded. I never found out what happened to the store manager, but I would strongly bet he did not survive those following 6 years. Story 95. When I pretended to be asleep in the car so my dad would carry me inside, they just left me in the car. Story 96. When I was 15, my mom abandoned me to live on the streets and use drugs. A man who resembled a famous rapper allowed me to stay in his apartment, but I had to sell drugs to pay the rent. Things escalated quickly. Story 97. Realizing how easily someone can move on ages you. My childhood ended when someone I loved with every fiber of my being decided that saying, "I love you," was no longer possible. A friend from church told me that I deserve better. I am still trying to have grace with myself and understand what others are telling me, but it's hard. Story 98. In 2019, I finished school and enrolled in a university course for further education. Then 2020 happened, and after the challenges of the pandemic, I struggled to get my life back on track, if it was ever on track to begin with. I lack many social, physical, and economic skills, which makes me feel like a background character outside of my family. Story 99. When I watched two people I thought were my friends almost harm each other for no reason, I realized we were all struggling. They had fallen into a negative influence and started arguing for no clear reason. When I understood that I needed to become more responsible or risk facing similar challenges, I recognized that the days of inviting everyone over to play games or ride our bikes down the road were over. Story 100. When I was 26, I went to my dentist. As I sat in the waiting room, which was full of toys and other people my age with their own kids, I started to suspect something. Then my dentist said, "Hey, listen, it's time you found an adult dentist. I am going to retire soon and want to focus on pediatric dentistry." I thought, but I've always come to this dentist since I basically had teeth. Story 101. Losing a parent is a profound experience. It forces you to grow up quickly, especially when you have to be strong for the surviving parent. Hearing my mom cry herself to sleep at night was heartbreaking. Story 102. When my mother asked me if she should divorce my dad while we were at the domestic violence shelter, I was in 4th grade. I became the primary decision maker in my family from that point on. Once I could legally work at 14, I helped pay the bills to keep the utilities on. Story 103. When a grown man tried to get my friend and me to come to his van to take topless photos, we were about 12 or 13 years old. Story 104. My 3rd week of college coincided with September 11th. Many of my high school friends enlisted in the military. It was a shocking moment, realizing that this situation was very real and that my friends could go to war and be in danger. Fortunately, none lost their lives, but a few are struggling significantly due to their experiences. It served as a wake-up call to see how little the authorities care about veterans. Story 105. Signing the form to begin chemotherapy for testicular cancer. The same day, my parents were burying my grandmother. I was too ill to attend the funeral, so I was all alone in the hospital. Story 106. In December 2007, I was 11 years old and I remember picking out a comic book from a shelf while I was bored. I noticed the publication date was May 14th, 2003. My heart skipped a beat reading that, and I instantly remembered better times from my childhood. It was the first time I had felt nostalgia for something. Life never really felt the same after that. It's a funny thing to think about back then because I was still in my childhood, but it fascinated me and made me yearn for the earlier days of my life, even if they were only 4 years ago at that point. Now, it's been over 20 years, and I still yearn for them to some degree. I like to think that was the day my experience of being a teenager began, along with a certain action I learned about a few days later. I doubt I would have done that a month prior. Story 107. I had to give up the hobby I love the most due to a lack of time and funds to take care of my children. No regrets. Story 108. Turning 18 in an abusive relationship was challenging. Everything revolved around pleasing my partner, sex, and substances. I was isolated from family and friends, made to feel very small, and often cried. I was also assaulted. Once I escaped, I felt I needed to rebuild my life. I had to learn how to communicate with people again and how to function in public. After some time, I began to mourn the loss of my innocence and childhood. I remember life before the drugs and chaos, which was vivid despite the emotional ups and downs. It's been 5 years since I left that situation, and I am very happy to be in a safe relationship and no longer reliant on stimulants. Story 109. When I first became aware as a being, the first thing we kindergarten kids had to do was pretend to be a baby, baby A or baby B. I didn't want to be either. The kindergarten teacher scolded me until I cried. I pointed out that my best friend wasn't doing it either. He only did it because he was scared of the teacher. She looked at me smugly, as if I were an adult, someone she wanted to bring down for whatever reason. I glared back at her. She claimed I had no discipline, but I understood the word from reading books, so I shouted that I had discipline. She shouted at me until I cried, making me feel like a monster. I cried a lot. In the end, I pretended to be baby, sucking on a bottle, and it was over. The moment I realized my childhood was officially over was during the first moment of my childhood. It's confusing, I know. I think I experienced memory loss or something. Story 110. When my mom and I visited my dad, who was working a new job in another city, he had a publication about swingers on the nightstand. Story 111. When I went back to a community swimming pool for the first time and renewed my library card after moving back recently, I discovered a $12 charge for a book I had borrowed 20 years ago. I also realized I could not remember the last time I swam there. My childhood had ended a while ago, and it struck me in that moment. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.